I'm so excited today to have Liza Mundy here with us today to talk about her book, Code Girls, who's going to really shine the light on the 10,000 women who served our country as code breakers and cryptographers. Liza is a New York Times bestselling author of The Richer Sex, How the New Majority of Female Breadwinners is Transforming Sex, Love, and Family, and Michelle, a Biography. She was a longtime reporter at the Washington Post and has contributed to numerous publications, including The Atlantic, Time, The New Republic, Slate, Mother Jones, and Politico. She is a frequent communicator on prominent national television shows, radio, and online news outlets. A senior fellow at New America, Liza is one of the nation's most foremost experts on women and work issues. So with that, thank you, Liza.
Writing this book was a great pleasure. As a Northern Virginian, so much of it actually took place in the landscape that I live in. Arlington Hall, where the Army codebreakers worked, is about a mile from my house, and I actually saw the apartment. The apartment where my central character lived is still there, Fillmore Gardens. You may know it. It's not far from Columbia Pike, and I walked the distance from where she lived to Arlington Hall, which is still there, where people in the State Department train. So the reporting and research process really brought to life for me the history of the landscape that we live in, at the same time that I hope that it's bringing to light the history of women's contributions to our country and our nation's service that has also been hidden for so long. So, and I know there's nothing more exciting than a good PowerPoint presentation, and I promise to try not to be boring. And my presentation consists mostly of photographs, some of which are in the book, but some of which I didn't have space for in the book, but I still love them. And so I hope that they'll enhance your experience when you read the book. So I love this photo because this shows the plight of educated women in 1942. This is the graduating class, or some of the top members of the graduating class at Goucher College in May of 1942. And they attained their college degrees at a time when only 4% of American women got a college education, a four-year college education. And the reason that percentage was so small was because so many campuses at the time were still closed to women. Most of the Ivy League schools, many state universities, including the University of Virginia. And so women's colleges had been founded in the late 19th century, like Goucher, to provide an education for motivated young women at a time when there was a lot of feeling that women didn't need a college education and that education wasn't even good for women. And the other reason that so few women got a college education was because there was no financial payoff. Medical schools were largely closed to women. Engineering schools, law schools, all those slots were held open for breadwinning men. So these top graduates were really looking at a job landscape that consisted of school teaching. That was really the only occupation you could realistically hope for as a female college graduate. Journalism had some opportunities. Every now and then, med schools would admit a few women, but the job landscape was minuscule for educated women, and so many families didn't consider it worth it to pay the tuition for their daughter to go to college. But the other reason to go to college for many women was to get your MRS degree. So many families would send their daughter to school with the hope that they would marry a man from a neighboring men's school. And in the case of Goucher, that would be often Annapolis. The Naval Academy is about 20 miles from Goucher, which at the time was located in downtown Baltimore. It's in Towson now, and it's coeducational now. But back in the 40s, it was a pretty gritty neighborhood that it was in downtown Baltimore, and it had a combination of women who boarded there, often sent there by their families with the hope of marrying a Navy man, and also girls who had grown up in Baltimore, attended public schools, and just really wanted to go to college. Often they're on scholarship because their families couldn't afford the tuition, and they also couldn't afford to board. And I interviewed a number of women about why they went to college, what they were aspiring for, and as you can imagine, they were just often young women who were incredibly motivated to learn. They loved high school, they loved learning, they loved math, they loved science or languages, and they just wanted to go to college and would do anything that they could to get there. But as you can see, upon graduation, they had all these rituals that were meant to sort of signal that they were being ushered into the world of marriage. So in this case, it was a May court. They were dressed in virginal white. I don't really know what a May court signifies beyond that, but I know that the other schools like Wellesley and Smith and Radcliffe also had these end of year rituals. Wellesley had the annual senior class hoop roll, and the tradition was that the winner of the senior class hoop roll would be the class's first bride. So at the same time that they were getting really rigorous education from top-notch schools, the dean of Goucher, Dorothy Stimson, was an authority on Copernicus. The English professor at Goucher, Ola Winslow, was the first woman to receive a Pulitzer Prize in biography for a biography that she wrote of a theologian named Jonathan Edwards. So they were being educated by top faculty. There was no grade inflation. I've seen some of their transcripts, and the grading was really tough at these schools. So they were getting great educations, but they were also under a lot of pressure to get married, and that was really the expectation when they graduated, was to get their MRS as well. But what I love about this photo is that even as this tradition is being enacted in this ritual, two of these women, Jacqueline Jenkins, who when she got married would become Jacqueline Jenkins Nye, mother of Bill Nye the Science Guy, and Gwyneth Gaminder, had already been secretly tapped by the U.S. Navy and were being trained to become code breakers. So even as they were wearing their beautiful ball gowns, they had spent 6 months in a locked classroom at the top of Goucher Hall at night, learning secretly this arcane field that they had never heard of called cryptanalysis. They were learning about Playfair ciphers and Wheatstone ciphers and these sort of obscure coding systems that had been developed during the Renaissance. They were learning to take frequency counts. They were doing work that they couldn't tell anybody about. Their families didn't know they were doing this. Their boyfriends at Annapolis didn't know that they were doing this. Nobody knew that they were doing it, and they wouldn't even talk to each other about it when they were doing their training. And what they didn't know was that women at a number of other women's colleges were doing the same work simultaneously. And the reason that the women were doing this work was, of course, 6 months before this, or 5 months, Pearl Harbor was the catastrophic event that propelled America into World War II. It was a total surprise to the U.S. Navy, even though our fleet was anchored in Pearl Harbor, our Pacific Fleet. Nobody anticipated that the Japanese were going to send bombers and ships to attack our fleet. And so at the same time that it propelled us into global total war in 2 major oceans on different continents, it also exposed the fact that we had a huge intelligence deficit in our U.S. military and our government. It's hard for us to believe at a time when we have 17 intelligence agencies that we had almost nothing at the beginning of World War II. We didn't have the CIA, we didn't have the NSA, we didn't have any of our modern intelligence agencies. The Navy had a very small code-breaking operation at the time, very small. The Army had also a very small bureau, but they needed to scale up unimaginably and ramp up our intelligence gathering. Of course, we were going to be building spy networks overseas, but that takes time. But the thing that we could start doing immediately was intercepting hundreds and thousands of enemy military messages and decrypting them and learning their contents right away so that we could not have another Pearl Harbor happen. And so there was a lot of recrimination within the U.S. Navy about why it had happened, at the same time that they were desperately scaling up their code-breaking operations. And in fact, when I was doing my research at the National Archives, I found the document in which somebody got the bright idea. Up until then, the Navy had gotten its small group of cryptanalysts from the male Ivy League. They liked to recruit from elite learning institutions that were both prestigious and rigorous, but also socially well-connected. They liked to get their men from MIT and Yale. And so at a time when all young American men were shipping out to the Atlantic and the Pacific and Europe, somebody in the Navy got the bright idea that if we can't get the guys from Yale and MIT anymore, we should look for a new source, which is women's colleges. So that's when the light bulb went on for the U.S. Navy that maybe these incredibly motivated, highly educated young women who had no job prospects otherwise except teaching school could be used for cryptanalysis. And so unbeknownst to anybody, the message had gone out all up and down the Atlantic seaboard to Wellesley, to Smith, to Radcliffe, to Bryn Mawr, to Goucher, quietly to faculty members and deans, we need your best senior girls. We need girls who are loyal, but who are also motivated and persistent, who have skills in math and science and languages, and we need to secretly train them in cryptanalysis. So these surprised young women were called into meetings with deans and faculty members who they knew, and they were asked 2 questions: do you like crossword puzzles, and are you engaged to be married? And if they answered yes to the first and no to the second, then they would be invited in to take these training courses during their senior year in secret. And then if they survived the course, if they persisted, if they did well on the problem sets, then they would be invited down in June of 1942 to immediately start working as code breakers for the U.S. Navy. And so that's what the Navy was doing the first 6 months that we were in the war. But meanwhile, the U.S. Army needed also a vast cohort of code breakers. The Navy, the U.S. Navy at the outbreak of our involvement was primarily going to be working on the fleet code used by the Japanese Navy. But that left hundreds and thousands of other code systems that we needed entry into. And the U.S. Army was charged with the code systems that were being used by the Japanese Army, which was spread out now all over the Pacific. The Japanese had captured the Philippines, they had captured Guam, they had captured an immense amount of territory. They were setting up code systems all over the Pacific. Meanwhile, there were any number of new code systems being used in Europe as well, and we were going to be helping the British break those. We had full responsibility for code breaking in the Pacific, both the Japanese Navy and both the Japanese Army, which used entirely different code systems, and each of those services used multiple code systems. They might have a main fleet code, but they set up temporary systems or smaller systems throughout the Pacific. And so the Army had to compete with the Navy to find young women. So the Navy had already sewn up the northeastern seaboard. So the Army hit upon a strategy of going to teachers' colleges, of going to land-grant universities that were coeducational, where they were often training women to be teachers, or going to actually look for school teachers, women who had already graduated and were teaching school. So this is one of the women in my book, Dorothy Ramallah. I interviewed her at an assisted living facility here in Northern Virginia, and she was taking math classes at Indiana State Teachers College in Pennsylvania with the hope of being a math teacher, which was not always a realistic goal for a woman at the time, actually. Even if you could expect teaching work, you couldn't always expect to be hired as a math teacher because women were not really identified. They just weren't encouraged to go into math. So and this is the central character of my book, who is still alive and enjoying the many book parties that she's attended, and the after parties, actually, that she has also attended at 97. And she was teaching school in Chatham, Virginia, under fairly chaotic circumstances when she was recruited by the Army to come to Washington to take work, and she didn't even know what it was going to be. But the strategy that the Army used was to send its handsomest young officers throughout the South and the Midwest to lure these young school teachers to Washington. And in the South in particular, and I say this as a Southerner, the thinking was that Southern women were particularly susceptible to the charms of a handsome man. And so if these officers were sort of lurking in post offices and hotels, luring the young women to apply for work with the War Department, that the women would be eager to sign up with the hope that they would come to Washington and marry or date a man who looked like this officer recruiting them. And the funny thing was that marriage, as you can see, is a thread to this recruiting effort. And in fact, a lot of the Navy women, when they were asked if they were engaged, lied and said that they weren't, because whatever work they were being invited to do sounded a lot more interesting than sitting around waiting to see if their boyfriend or fiance survived the war. They also wanted to help bring the men back home. But Dot Braden and many of the other women were actually trying to get out of engagement. She was engaged to a college boyfriend who was now in training. He had sent her a ring. She was wearing the ring because women were told that they shouldn't upset the troops. They needed to keep up morale, but she didn't want to marry him. And she didn't want to follow him to training camp in California. So here was another opportunity at a time when she was being very pressured, as many women were, to actually get out of a marriage, that she, sort of a premature engagement that she hadn't really signed on to, and come to Washington. So Dot gladly signed up for the war effort. She didn't care whether the recruiting officer was handsome or not. She just knew that here was a chance to take work that paid almost twice as much as teaching school. She was making $900 a year teaching school at high school. And it was a chance to come to Washington, where she had never been, even though Lynchburg, where she grew up, is just about 3 hours south of here. She had never been to Washington. And it was a chance to serve the war effort. She had 2 younger brothers. She was the oldest of 4. She had a single mother. She was helping support the household. She needed to continue supporting it, but her brothers were already in the Army, and like every other American, she wanted to do everything that she could to bring the boys back home. So she gladly signed up and took a train to Washington, D.C., having no idea what she had signed up to do or even where she was going to stay the night. And so she took the train into Washington Union Station. She caught a cab to a place in Arlington she had never heard of. She barely had enough money to pay the cab ride. She found herself at a place called Arlington Hall that had been a junior college up until the Army had kicked all the girls out who were studying there, had taken it over, and had started to build a massive code-breaking compound. Dot's first day, she signed a loyalty oath. It's the same oath that the president signs and that public servants sign, you know, vowing to serve the U.S. government and the Constitution. She also signed a secrecy oath that she would, whatever she was going to be doing, she would keep the work secret. She wouldn't tell anybody about it, and that if she did, because it was wartime, it was treason, and the penalty for treason was death. So her first day in Washington, she realized that whatever she was going to be doing, she would be shot if she told anybody about it. And the good thing was she couldn't do it right away because she still didn't know what she was going to be doing. Nor did the Army have a place for her to stay. She thought that they would put her up, but after she signed all those scary papers, and as she said to me later, I knew I was really in for it now. After she signed all those scary papers, she thought that they would take her to wherever she would be staying, and instead they told her that she had to rent a room at a local sort of dorm that had been hastily constructed where Arlington Cemetery is now. So that was her introduction to Washington. This was the building where she would find herself working. It was a temporary wartime building that was constructed on the grounds of Arlington Hall. There had formerly been riding rings and tea houses and gardens for the denizens of the junior college, but it had been transformed to war work. She would find herself in school learning the geography of Asia. She would be assigned something that she had never heard of. She would be working the water transport code that was being used by the supply ships that were supplying the Japanese army that was everywhere in the Pacific. All the Japanese soldiers in the Pacific had to be regularly, daily supplied with water, with food, with fuel, with medical supplies, with animals, with veterinary supplies, with airplane parts. And Dot didn't realize it then, and she didn't realize it until about our 20th interview, that she was part of one of the 3 most important code-breaking efforts of World War II, that it was that important that she and these other school teachers were working to sink all those Japanese supply ships over and over, thousands of supply ships. And the school teachers were so successful at the work that they did that most of the Japanese army deaths were the result of starvation and disease because they couldn't get their food and they couldn't get their medicine. And in fact, the women codebreakers would find themselves in 1944 and 45 breaking messages that said things like, we have a supply of rice that can only last 2 weeks. We're chewing it raw instead of boiling it because it makes it last a little bit longer. So they were actually reading messages that told what the outcome of their efforts were. So it was very, very serious, important work that they were doing. And I'll talk about what the other 2 most important code-breaking efforts were. But she had no idea that what she was doing was that important to the outcome of the war. She knew it was important. She took it seriously. She was part of this massive influx of women. This just shows you a little bit the extent of the operation. There were other women who were receiving the messages from teletype. There were other women who were maintaining an information desk so that the transport messages, so that they could illuminate the content. They were keeping track of everything that we would use Wikipedia for these days, or our own internal information departments. These women were keeping, careful lists of ships, and because all the supply ships had been commercial ships before the war, and so from Lloyd's of London, they had gotten a list of all the commercial Japanese ships, and they could tell the codebreakers what this ship likely consisted of. And there was another group of women. Dot was working this code system called 2468. that was an enciphered code system. The Japanese had massive code books. And when they were encoding a message that might say that a certain supply ship would be leaving Hiroshima or leaving some Japanese port and headed for another, and what it was laden with, what it was carrying, where it was likely to be, they would render all the words into 4-digit code groups. So a word like Maru, which was supply ship, might be 6782. And then they would add another set of digits to it, which was enciphering. It was encryption. So they would encrypt their code manually, laboriously, using books. And what the school teachers had to learn to do was strip out the encryption to get down to the code groups and then try to figure out what the message likely said. So they had to look for stereotyped words that they could likely expect in a message coming out of Hiroshima at a certain time of the month. It might be talking about race, or it might be talking about animals, or it might be talking about medical parts. So they would look for stereotyped words that they could expect. So that's what Dot was being trained to do. It was a lot of math, but it was a lot of languages. And the good thing was she had a 4-year liberal arts education from Randolph-Macon Women's College, and she had a lot of math, and she had a lot of languages. So what they had to do next was they had to take that message, after they had pushed it along, to an overlapper who would stack up a lot of similar messages, again trying to tease out what certain code groups likely stood for, because the code systems would change, and the word for Maru one month wouldn't necessarily be the same code group the next month. So they were constantly re-breaking the code system. And so she had to take it to the next station, which was a woman called the overlapper. And the reason I like this photo is she hated the overlapper that she had to work with, who was a woman named Miriam from New York City. And Dot was from Lynchburg, Virginia, very southern accent. And Miriam would say, and Dot said to me later that Miriam was the most condescending northerner she had ever met. And I think she was probably the first northerner that Dot had ever met. But there was a clash. I mean, even as men were leaving the country, we're going to the Pacific, we're going to Europe, you know, in great peril, but also being exposed to Paris, being exposed to, you know, the South Pacific. The sort of corresponding situation for these women was to come to Washington, and it was to meet other women from other parts of the country, small towns in other places, the Midwest or the South or the North. At Arlington Hall, the Army facility, it was mostly Southern school teachers, but there were Northerners, both women and also men who were literary men or college professors who came to do this work. And one of the literary men referred to the women as the Southern women as the jewels. And he did that because he thought so many Southern women were named Ruby or Opal or Pearl or Emerald. And when I was looking through the rosters of the female codebreakers, there were a lot of rubies and opals and pearls. And there were also some actual jewels. And I interviewed a woman named Jewel who came from Rock Hill, South Carolina. She had gone to Winthrop College there. She was a high school band director when she was recruited. And musical ability is also a good marker for code-breaking talent because it has to do with an ability to recognize patterns. So I just thought that that was funny, that there was this, even as they were doing this incredibly important work, there were clashes. There were geographic clashes. They didn't necessarily like each other. They didn't necessarily like the next person on the assembly line, but they had to work together seamlessly, and they did. I include this picture because the woman who's laughing down at her work beside what looks like a dead plant is a woman named Carrot Christy, and she was recruited out of Russell Sage College in New York, so she was one of the Northerners. She later confessed to being somewhat condescending toward the Southern. The Southerners weren't considered to be as well educated as the Northerners, actually, and I interviewed Carrot Christy before she died, and she did admit that they perhaps weren't as sort of respectful of their Southern colleagues as they should have been. But Anne was an incredible engineering talent, even though she had majored in English at Russell Sage. Her dad was an engineer and an inventor. And when she was brought to Arlington Hall, again, having no idea what she was going to be doing, very little training, she and her supervisor, who was a school teacher from West Virginia named Wilma Berryman, they broke the code system that was at the beginning of every Japanese Army message that told where it was coming from and where it was going to. So this was an early form of traffic analysis. They broke that radio code, so they were getting daily detailed information about where the Japanese Army was, who the commanders were, what kind of volume of messages were being sent, and where they were going to, specifically who they were addressed to, whether new units were being set up. So they were able to develop every day something called Order of Battle, which told the Pentagon where the Japanese were and where the Japanese army was in the Pacific, where they were likely to be going, whether it looked like there was some flurry of traffic going somewhere that had never gone before. So every day there was a unit of women who constructed an order of battle report for U.S. military intelligence. So they were not only doing code breaking, they were doing intelligence, and they were doing military intelligence and sending it every day to the Pentagon. There was another group of women who were breaking the diplomatic system that the Japanese diplomats who were actually stationed in Europe were sending back to Tokyo. So this, ironically enough, was one of our best sources of intelligence out of Europe for what was going on in Europe, because the Japanese diplomats were talking to Hitler, they were talking to Mussolini, they were talking to all the Axis leaders. Being diplomats, they were sending incredibly long reports back to Tokyo, very opinionated, very literate, and they were communicating in something called a cipher, which is a system where it has nothing to do with code groups. It is a system where one letter is transformed into another letter. So their messages would be actually written out in Romanji, which is a sort of phonetic Japanese using Western letters. And it would be in Cipher using a machine that we called Purple. And we had broken that machine in 1940 thanks to a woman named Genevieve Grochin, they had been working on it for several years. She had an insight one day that allowed them to break that machine. So we were able during the entirety of the war to read all the dispatches that the Japanese diplomats were sending to Tokyo. And just as an example of the kind of intelligence we were getting, when we were planning our D-Day invasion, we needed to know where the coast of France was well fortified and where it wasn't. And the Japanese diplomats had been invited by Hitler to tour the coast of France because they were very proud of their fortifications, and they dutifully reported back to Tokyo where France was well fortified, where it wasn't. So we were able to choose Normandy as the best place to make the landing because it wasn't as well fortified as a place like Calais. So that's the kind of intelligence that we were getting from these messages. This is just another example, again, of how vast this manual operation was, although there were a lot of machines being used as well, rudimentary computers. As you can see, it was handwork and brain work. There was also at the Army facility a group of African-American code breakers. The Navy didn't admit African Americans into its code breaking units, but the Army did. It was a segregated unit, and they were working the codes and ciphers of the private sector. So just as our banks and companies and us and everybody who communicates by email, we encrypt all of our communications. While banks and companies encrypted their communications back then, they were sending them over telegraph and radio. So it was this group's job to read that traffic and to try to figure out if any American companies were doing business with Hitler or doing business with companies like Mitsubishi, because of course they weren't supposed to be doing that. So this was incredibly important work as well. There were other women who were doing cybersecurity. They were encoding our messages. They were constantly testing our military security to make sure that our messages weren't being broken to the extent that the enemy messages were being broken. They were planning deception programs in which we would manufacture fake military traffic to try to fool the enemy. So when we were planning our D-Day invasion, this woman was involved in a program where we wanted to persuade the Germans that the landing would occur in Calais. So there was a fictitious Army group that was created. It didn't exist, so it really wasn't created, but we were charged with creating radio traffic that would convince the Germans that this group did exist. So the women had to study our military traffic, what would tend to go out at a certain time of day, what the traffic would look like, what it would consist of, and create what they call dummy traffic. It had to work not only before D-Day, but it had to continue to fool the Germans after D-Day so they would keep their troops that were in Calais and not come to Normandy and try to repel the successive waves of the operation. So it was incredibly important military work that they were doing. Meanwhile, the women who had been recruited from those Seven Sisters colleges and from Goucher came to work at the Navy code breaking facility, which is on Nebraska Avenue. It's where the Department of Homeland Security is now. It had been a girls' school called Mount Vernon Seminary. The Navy kicked those girls out. They had to take classes in Garfinkel's department store while they were looking for another place where they could take classes. classes. And the Navy women actually joined the Navy. The waves were created, women accepted for voluntary emergency service. The Navy wanted its codebreakers in uniform. So all these women joined the U.S. military, and it was also opened up to regular enlisted women who tested well for intelligence and aptitude. So if you were a woman who hadn't had the benefit of a college education, but you were determined to join the Navy, then you might be routed based on the test that you took into the naval code-breaking operation. So it ultimately became a quite democratic institution, aside from its obvious segregation and the fact that African-American women, even once they were admitted into the waves in 1945, weren't admitted into the code-breaking operation, which was very paranoid, more paranoid than it really should have been. But as you can see, the women were working inside this compound. These are some photos I found at the National Archives that I don't think had ever been published or seen before, and they show the interior of these top secret code-breaking compounds. The Navy women were working that big Japanese fleet code. The importance of that fleet code had been sort of first fully understood at the Battle of Midway, which was in June of 1942. It was our first big triumph in the Pacific. When we read the Japanese fleet code, we understood that they were sending a huge flotilla of ships to ambush our ships to try to finish us off because Pearl Harbor hadn't done that. And we anticipated the movements, and we ambushed the ambush and won the Battle of Midway, which is one of the most famous sea victories of all time. And that was what put code breaking really on the map during World War II. And these women, like the Army women, were part of an incredibly important sort of assembly line. You can see that their messages are actually being transported by conveyor belt from one woman to the other. And there was a woman that I interviewed who did this work. She had never talked about it to anybody. And we could tell what was happening in the Pacific because the stack of messages would get larger. So you can see those are Japanese fleet messages that the women are sorting. They're getting a start on, they're sending it on down the line. And among the documents I came upon in the archives were messages they would get before any kind of U.S. action, before any kind of, as we were pushing back across the Pacific, all these incredibly dangerous amphibious landings that American Marines were making and the U.S. Navy was making, the women would be told something's about to happen in the Pacific. You all recovered 2,000 additives last week. The additives are the number that would be added to a code group in order to encrypt it. The women had to strip it out. They called it recovering additives. They would be told, you know, you recovered a certain number of additives last week. We need you to recover more this week in order to, you know, protect our troops as they're making their landings. And then you would see messages saying, congratulations, you not only met your quota, but you exceeded it. So they were working incredibly hard. I love this. They're actually worksheets that are just floating around in the files in the National Archives. This is the Japanese fleet code. It was a 5-digit system. Again, it was an enciphered code group, so you could see the code group that the women would have seen. Looks like somebody stripping out the additives, and then they're starting to figure out what the words actually stood for. And so it was incredibly hard, stressful work. They couldn't talk to anybody about it. They were told that if anybody asked what they did at that giant walled, guarded compound, they were to say that they were secretaries, that they sharpened pencils and emptied wastebaskets. Because they were women, people believed them. They believed that the work that they were doing couldn't possibly be important. So they often didn't, the conversation wouldn't even last that long if people asked them what they did. But I love this. This is a completely different, this shows you how many different code systems were in use. The Japanese Navy would set up lesser code systems to use between islands. So this was called the Inter-Island Cipher. It was a completely different code system. There was a group of Wellesley women who came down and who were assigned to the Inter-Island Cipher. And what I love about this is this was a system where the key changed once a month. So once a month, the women would have to work furiously to figure out the new key and get back into the cipher. But and it would take them about 3 or 5 days to do that. They got really good at it. And so in the intervening amount of time, they could really party. And so even as the work was really stressful and urgent and important, they were having a great time in Washington. They were living in barracks sometimes. The college graduated the college graduates in the Navy were officers now. They were made officers, so they were able to live in officer housing or group homes. And they were having fabulous parties and living it up in Washington. So I actually found the oral history of their male commander. And the women would come to him and say, well, when can we have a big blowout party? And he would look at this wall calendar and see when the cipher was going to change. And he would say, all right, well, you can have it in the middle of the month, because then that'll give you 2 weeks to recover from your hangovers before you have to break back into the key system. So he deeply admired their code-breaking prowess, but he also deeply admired their partying ability. And what was interesting, though, was this cipher became really important in April of 1942. Some messages were received in the Pacific that told that Admiral Yamamoto, who was the commander of the Japanese fleet and the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, was going to be making an inspection tour of some Pacific islands. Codebreakers out in the Pacific got busy working on those messages, but the inter-island cipher was also being used to supplement those messages, and we were able to completely reconstruct his itinerary in time for us to send planes in the air to intercept his planes. He was at the exact place that the codebreakers thought he was going to be at the exact time, and we shot down his plane and basically assassinated an enemy commander, the head of the entire Japanese fleet. The women were in on that effort to the point where oral histories that I came upon in my research said that cheering broke out in the code-breaking compound when they learned that Yamamoto's plane had been shot down. And that was a top secret effort. Of course, it couldn't be known that code-breaking had led to that effort, because if the enemy knows that you've broken their codes, the enemy will change their code system. So they couldn't tell anybody. And this just shows, again, the sort of the breadth of the work that they were doing. The Battle of Midway and the sinking of the supply ships were two of the most important code-breaking efforts of the war. The other famous important effort was the elimination of the German U-boats that were lurking in the Atlantic and decimating our shipping as we were taking troops and supplies to Europe to fight the war in Europe. Anybody who's seen The Imitation Game or read about the Enigma system that the Germans were using to encipher their messages knows that Alan Turing first broke that system. Actually, some Polish mathematicians first broke it, but then Alan Turing did. But then the Germans changed the design of their machine, and the British code breaking no longer worked, and the Americans had to get involved and build 100 machines that could break the new system that the Germans were using. So the Americans became very involved with that effort. There was a group of women who helped build the machines, and then the machines were brought to Washington, and the women ran the machines. They broke the daily German messages that told where the U-boats were. They did the math necessary to figure out how a letter E might go through a bunch of different permutations to come out as H. They would plug a different menu into the machines every couple of days. So they were basically doing early computer menus, devising early computer menus, and again breaking these messages so that we were able to completely eliminate the U-boats from the Atlantic and bring over the massive convoys that were necessary for our successful D-Day landing. And for me, one of the most moving chapters in my book was when the Navy women were breaking the German messages when D-Day was happening. So they came in for their midnight shift on June 6th. They knew that D-Day was in the making, but they didn't know when it was going to happen. They didn't think it would happen that night because there was a full moon. But at about 1:30 in the morning, our time, they started getting messages, and they were experiencing D-Day from the point of view of the Germans. So essentially, they were reading German messages that said, holy, there are thousands of Allied ships on the horizon in the English Channel. And so the women were frantically working all night to break those messages and experiencing D-Day in this unique position to experience D-Day from the point of view of the Germans. And one of them said that after she got off her shift at 8 a.m., they knew that it had happened. They didn't know all the details. They didn't know what the casualties were. So the women all took the bus to St. Albans Chapel, which is right next to the National Cathedral, and they prayed because they didn't know what else to do. And I have to say, every time I drive up, Wisconsin Avenue now and pass St. Albans, I think of those women in the church the morning after D-Day. And these are just some photos, again, that show that they were having a good time in Washington. The sort of disparity between the urgency and stress of the work they were doing and the fun that they were having living on their own for the first time in Washington, having disentangled themselves from whatever engagements they didn't want to make, in some cases having lost fiancés and husbands to the fighting, worrying about their brothers all the time. They were still, blowing off steam. They were writing letters to GIs. That was really important for women to write letters to GIs. My central character, Dot Braden, would become engaged to a man through correspondence. She never told him that she was actually writing about 6 men simultaneously. That was actually the hardest secret for me to get out of her, was how many men she was writing, but that was actually really common because the women were told to keep up morale. This is my central character with her great friend, Ruth Weston, a mathematician from Bourbon, Mississippi, who took the train from Bourbon, another dissatisfied school teacher who would go on to work at the Japanese shipping codes. And she would, Dot called her Crow, her name was Carolyn, would go on to work for NSA into the 1950s when she had to resign because she got pregnant. Otherwise, she would have continued doing the work. And this shows Dot, who's in the striped shirt, my central character, her husband Jim, who was a meteorologist in Africa during the war, and Crow, her great friend, who at that time was probably no longer at NSA, and then Crow's husband. And their friendship was so strong that when Crow, the woman in pink, became engaged to her husband, she had Dot and her husband come up and vet him before she would marry him. So that's how powerful the friendships were. This is a group of Navy women who all worked that Japanese fleet code, and they became such great friends after the war, and they missed each other so much after the war when they went back and they did get married and they started having children, that they started something I'd never heard of called a Roundrobin letter, which one woman would write a letter to another woman, and that woman would send both letters on to the third, who would then send hers and the 2 others on. And that round-robin letter kept going for 75 years. They didn't stop. As the women died and dropped away, they kept going. So by the time I was doing my reporting, 2 of the women were still alive, and they were writing back and forth to each other almost every day. And the woman in the striped shirt in the front, Ruth Mirsky, is still alive, and her email is Ruth the Wave. Because needless to say, a lot of them are online now because they were code girls then, and they are still code girls, code women now. So I'm just going to finish up by showing 4 videos of the actual women. When I interviewed them, I've become very attached to all of them, and I thought you would just enjoy hearing their voices and talking about their experiences. So the first one is Dot Braden, my central character. You can hear her accent.
With my 2 suitcases, my umbrella, and my raincoat, I went down to the train. Now, my uncle had to take me down there. No car. And my mother and her sister were standing there crying when I got on the train. I was very secure that everything was going to be just fine. Washington would receive me with open arms.
And of course, the joke was that when she got there, she had to sign her secrecy oath and, agree to be shot if she told her secrets. And then they told her that they didn't have a place. They weren't going to put her up, and she had to pay her own rent. So the next interview is Anne Seeley, who was a senior at Smith when she received that secret tap, and was asked about crossword puzzles and marriage and invited to do something that she had never heard of. She had never talked to anybody about what she did, and you'll see from this little clip how well she remembered her work that many years later, never having talked about it.
Additive is obviously something that you add, but what do you add it to? You add it to a 5-digit code group, and the code group has a meaning, which is either a word or a phrase or a sentence or a Roman letter, because we're dealing in Japanese now. They didn't make much use of the Roman letters, but they often did to spell names of people like Roosevelt.
She also remembered the math that she had to do to strip out the additives, and she tried to explain it to me, and she became a little irritated when I was a little slow on the uptake, because I was saying, well, so they're additives, so are you subtracting or are you adding? And she said, well, you zeroize and add. I mean, how hard could that be? So it was just amazing how well she remembered her work, and the fact that a code group could stand for a whole word or it could stand for a letter, and if they were talking about Roosevelt, they had to spell it out, and so I just thought that was remarkable. And this is one of the women who worked on the German Enigma cipher, building and then running those machines.
We broke the code in August of 1943. And everybody says, what did they tell you? I said, nothing. All that Commander Meter announced at supper one night, good job, girls. You did good. And that's all he said.
So that just shows you the thanks that they got at the end of the war, after all that they did. And this last one is Dorothy Ramallah. You saw her picture. She was the woman recruited out of Indiana State Teachers College, where she was aspiring to be a math teacher. And she talks a little bit about why she was so motivated to do this work when she was invited to do it.
Bus came, and it was at 2 o'clock in the morning
She's talking about a bus.
that the Army sent a bus to get these. Oh, I don't know. It seemed to me it was all the men, you know, that there were no men left there in the college at that time, because they all had to go, I think, to Pittsburgh. You see, since I was taking mathematics, a lot of times I was one of maybe 2 girls that were in the classes, you see. So I knew so many of the fellows that were going on that bus. I'll never forget.
So Dorothy Ramallah became a math teacher after the war. She actually taught middle school math at the middle school in Arlington that my own kids attended. Of course, nobody knew what she had done. She was there a little bit before my kids were there. She then went to Yorktown High School. But I just love the image of Dorothy Ramallah teaching Algebra 1 or whatever to all these middle school kids who never would have dreamed that she was a code breaker sinking ships during World War II. Because, again, she never talked about it. She never told anybody about it. And I think because these women were so good about keeping the secret, because they were told after the war, never tell anybody what you did, and because nobody ever told them in the 80s and 90s when they were released from their vow of secrecy, nobody ever bothered to track them down and tell them that it was okay to talk, they continued to keep the secret, and so their contribution to history was virtually lost. And so we still have these incredible, absurd debates. Do women belong in tech? Why aren't there more women in Silicon Valley? Do women really belong in cybersecurity? I mean, this was early computer work that they were doing. This was early cybersecurity that they were doing. They were enciphering and encrypting and decrypting. They were running machines. They were early computers and devising computer menus. So, you know, I think the question is satisfactorily answered, that women belong in tech and that women pioneered tech, because so much of our STEM innovation came out of World War II. The men were all fighting, so it was the women who were doing it. So it's great to see books coming out like Hidden Figures, Rise of the Rocket Girls. I hope that this one adds to the discussion just to show how much really important work was being done by women, and hopefully if enough of these books are published, you know, eventually we won't have to have these debates anymore. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, with the silence, what triggered you to go after this topic?
I was reading a declassified NSA history. This became NSA. I mean, this is how NSA started, was with this work, and these operations would be merged to become what is now the NSA. And there were some internal histories about these efforts that mentioned the number of women who were doing the work. I happened to come across one of them, and I went out to our Cryptologic Museum in Fort Meade and interviewed the curator there, an historian, an NSA historian, and they told me about this effort, and I couldn't believe that it hadn't been written. And it's sort of like, you know, NASA knew about those women mathematicians of Hidden Figures. It wasn't a secret in the agency itself. It's just that the records hadn't really been made available. Nobody nobody had written about it up until then. And I have to say, once I went to the National Archives and saw the extent of the paper record that had names and rosters and addresses and contributions of women, I did feel that the historians who had been through those files over and over and over to write about code breaking had just neglected the women. I mean, I had to get a lot of stuff declassified that wasn't already out, but there was a fair amount of information that was already out in the public domain.
Was there a specific link to the Seven Sisters colleges and maybe even like an Army-Navy competition to getting them?
Oh yeah, there was a hot competition to get them, and the Navy, again, the Navy was a very elite force, and they liked, you know, the Ivy League and the female counterpart. But there were some colleges that both services went to simultaneously, like Connecticut College and Wheaton College were being competed for. And so I ran across some very angry memos in which the Navy said that the Army was poaching their girls. And then, interestingly enough, Brown University, which had Pembroke College associated with it, they got blackballed because one of the math professors started bragging about their connection with the Navy and that they were going to start teaching cryptology. And that was all it took for the Navy and the Army to say, if you're going to talk about this, we're not going to have you. So, so the women at Pembroke, I guess, didn't get recruited.
How did you go about getting that all this stuff declassified?
I was working with an NSA historian, a wonderful woman. Our federal historians are so great, the historians attached to federal agencies. And she pointed me to some files at the National Archives, and then I started going through rosters. And then I just started beating on their door a lot and trying to get, there are massive histories of the code-breaking operation that are multi-volumed. I was able to get a couple of volumes declassified. There were a couple of volumes that were available in the National Archives, but heavily redacted. And I would take photos of the pages and I'd send them to my contact at NSA, an official who was helping, and I would say, you know, look at this page, look at all the women's names in the footnotes, but I can't see what they were doing. You know, do you want this story out or not? And you know, can you please speed along the process of getting the full history declassified? And then one of the people in the history office was able to give me names of women who they had taken their oral histories along the way. There were about 20 women they had interviewed and done oral histories and immediately classified them. Even if they had taken an oral history in the 1990s, they just classified it. So I had to get a list of names and then request them through FOIA, and then I had to upgrade it to a mandatory declassification review.
How did you track down the women that you finally interviewed? Because there must be very few living, and on the roster they would have had maiden names. So how
Yeah,
did you find
God,
them?
I know, the maiden names. Oh, and the names would often change during their service because they might get married during the war, so they'd enter as one name and then exit another. Maybe they had remarried later in their lives. Yeah, so don't get me started on maiden names. But it was all reporting at a certain point is just desperate casting of fishing nets. So the NSA helped me find Dot because her friend Crow, who's no longer alive, her family had contacted the NSA at one point wanting more information about her service. They had that in their records. They put me in touch with Crow's family, who knew that Dot was still alive, put me in touch with her. I still had to really pull the secret out of her. It took a lot of convincing that she wouldn't be put in prison if she talked. And then I put some notices on like World War II magazines' websites. That's how I found Ann Seeley. But this just shows how there's so many more women than you would think. Like there were 10,000 women doing this work, at least. So yeah, I don't know what the actuarial odds are, but a fair number of women actually live into their 90s. So a friend of mine went to visit her mother at an assisted living facility in Maine. Her mother was Wellesley class of 43. My friend came back and said, okay, I have 3 for you. So there were 3 women living in that facility in Maine, and when my friend just mentioned at the dinner table to her mother that I was writing this book, they raised their hand. And it was just like a total surprise, even to the women, you know. And then what I've learned since my book is published is I've heard from hundreds of families whose mother did this work, but I've heard from some of the women themselves. So there were at least 20 or 30 other women I could have talked to. So again, they walk among us, and there are more out there still, I think, even than I realized.
Are there similarities with the Hello Girls from World War I in regard to when they left that service? Were there opportunities stripped for them? Were they still recognized as having been part of this option? Where the Hello Girls were actually told, no, you were never part of the military.
Right, like the WASPs.
Yeah.
Also, the Hello Girls were female telephone operators who went to France to connect calls. Incredibly important and brave. There's a great book out about them. So the Navy women were qualified for the GI Bill. So that was a big difference. The Army women worked as civilians. At the end, they were told, thanks for your service. Don't ever tell anybody what you did. And if you want another job after the war, too bad. You can't tell them what you did. That's what happened to Dot. But the Navy women at least had the GI Bill. So some of them were able to get college educations. Some of them were able to go to graduate school as a result of being part of the military. But this will make your blood boil. One of the really top women in the Navy facility who had been tapped out of Vassar, she knew that her work had sunk a whole convoy in one instance. She wanted to be an architect. So after the war, she wanted to use her GI Bill to go to architecture school, graduate school. And so she wrote several leading graduate schools applying. They said, I'm sorry, we're not admitting women. We got to hold all these spots open for returning men, returning military men, because that's fair, right? And she said, well, you know, I was in the military also. I was in the Navy. They said, we don't care. You know, we're going to hold the slots open for these bread-winning men. And she couldn't say, well, I sunk a convoy. You know, my work was also really important to the war. She couldn't say that. So she wasn't admitted. She didn't get to be an architect. She followed her husband who taught at University of Virginia, but then they moved to Cincinnati, and she ended up teaching herself computer science and running the computer science operations at the University of Cincinnati. So, you know, this was a generation of women who had enormous talent, who were able to show it during the war, make an incredible difference. And then we just tried to stuff that genie back in the bottle. But a number of them really did persist. And a number of them stayed on to work at NSA. Carrot Christy, who was the woman laughing at her dead plant, would go on to become the first female deputy director of NSA. She was incredibly important all during the Cold War. There's I've told that their top secret important conference room is named after her. So she's a legendary figure now at NSA, but I just wish that there were more women's names on the outside of buildings as instead of the inside conference rooms so that we knew a little bit more about this.
I might have missed it, but can you speak to how many lives were saved in World War II due to this code-breaking effort?
Yeah, it's hard to calculate exactly, obviously, but there was a flurry of recognition for the men after the war, and the calculation was that the war was shortened by at least a year, and you know that thousands or tens of thousands of lives were saved. They couldn't ever calculate, you know, the exact number. And there was I quote in my book, there was a member of Congress who stood and orated about all the importance of the code breaking. And he said, you know, our code breakers contributed to our military as much as any other group of men. And so the implication was that they were all male.
In your research, did you ever come across or where they crossed paths with the Navajo code talkers that they actually did a movie about and acknowledged?
So the Navajo code talkers were doing cybersecurity, right? They were encoding our own messages by speaking in Navajo. And I did find one oral history, and I wish I could have followed this up, of a woman who was trained. They ultimately the Navy set up communications training at Mount Holyoke where they were taught to do this work. But she said that she was taught Navajo and trained in code talking. So it was a communications school for naval officers. I don't know whether it's true or not. I couldn't really follow that thread. But I did at least see that crossover. I think the Navajo code talkers were mostly out in the Pacific, I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But she did say that she was taught the Navajo language.
How long did it take from conception, from this idea that your research or whatever document, and then started writing the book?
I interviewed Dot in the summer of 2014, and we're now in 2018. My book was published in October, so for me, the work took about 3 years. It didn't seem like enough, but at a certain point, it's like, you know, it's like a test. Time's up, pencils down. You can't have another year. Well, thank you so much. It's great audience.